Hello, everyone. This is Kevin Padula, the creator and host of the Story of Rhode Island podcast. This is a recent conversation that I had with Jack Henneman. He is the creator and host of the History of the Americans podcast. In our discussion, we take a look at a few different topics. We start off with discussing some of the colonies that were surrounding Rhode Island in the 17th century. We then look at the founders of Rhode Island. So we'll start with Roger Williams, but then we'll also cover Anne Hutchinson as well. And then we wrap it up by discussing just how incredibly radical of a society Rhode Island was in the 17th century, but also why Rhode Islanders should be so proud of the state's history. So I truly enjoyed this conversation with Jack, and I hope you do as well. So Jack, thank you so much for being on the Story of Rhode Island podcast. Super excited to have you here. If anyone is not familiar with Jack's podcast, you definitely need to give it a listen. It's incredible. For those who listen to my podcast, he has about 6 episodes specifically that discuss some of the early founders of Rhode Island. So, Jack, to start, I'd like to discuss presentism a bit as well, but then also go into your podcast and what it is and what it's all about. So I've heard you say before that presentism obscures rather than illuminates the past. So with that comment in mind, do you mind telling my listeners a little bit about your podcast and what it's all about?
Sure. Well, first, let me thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure. I always like getting on with other history podcasts, especially if they're as mired in the 17th century as I've been for the last, year and a half or something myself. It's really a fascinating and decisive time in American history, especially the 1630s, where you saw the founding of Massachusetts, Maryland, New Netherland, the full flowering of Virginia, and so it's a really great time to study, and eventually I'm going to move beyond that in mind. But I encourage everybody to learn more about those early days because they're remarkable. And I think you've done a great job with the Rhode Island pieces that I've been able to get through up till now, which is probably half a dozen episodes or more even. So delighted to do that. Look, presentism is easily defined at a very superficial level and much argued about in sort of technical terms by academic historians. Another sort of $5 word that is close to it in meaning is anachronism. But presentism is really the assigning or the examination of events in the past with too great an inflection of the morality of the present. It is all example I give in one of my episodes. It is easy enough to denounce somebody who burns down an indigenous village and kills a lot of people. That's easy to do. Nobody alive today thinks that was a good thing to do. But simply ending with that inquiry or denouncing the people who did it, because we would not do that today, I think misses the opportunity to understand why they did it today. And it could not have been, in my mind, that everybody then was just evil. It couldn't be in my mind then that everyone was just following orders. The interesting question is not why a few self-interested people whose names come down to us burned down that indigenous village in my hypothetical example, which happened plenty of times, but rather, why did ordinary people do these things? And I think that understanding that is incredibly important. And, people are, to a great degree, very willing to be open-minded about horrible things that go on in other countries today. It's very easy to look at those things, and we may strongly disapprove of them, but it's very easy to say, well, that's a different culture. Those are different people. Well, it's a truism in the study of history to say the past is another country. It really is. And yet, we're far less willing to look at, in many cases, and especially in sort of public discourse. Sorry, there's a dog shaking in the background here.
Oh, good.
We're far less willing to look at our own past as if it were another country and say these people were affected by entirely different things. They were influenced by different social factors, different economic considerations, different religious considerations, different understandings of the natural world, different political development, and so forth. And if you simply say this was all horrible, which seems to accompany an awful lot of, frankly, even the teaching of history, at least certainly before you get to college, you give people an easy way out. They don't have to do the hard work of understanding why these people did these things. And that's broadly speaking what I mean by it.
Yeah. And then so tell us a little bit more about like your podcast, like how long has it been going on for? How many episodes? Expand on that a little for us.
Sure thing. So I sort of did a bunch of prepare. I got the idea in really October of 2020. I went on a 3-week, 4,500-mile drive about during the pandemic. I wanted to see my mom, so I swabbed up and drove from Austin to Charlottesville, and I visited my mom. And having done that, and in all regard for safety at the time, I then drove around really all the way almost to the border of Canada and the Adirondacks, visiting friends along the way, did some hiking, and I sort of kept people who were mostly still at home informed on Facebook about all the stuff I was seeing and different behavior around the country, cultural differences in responding to the pandemic and all that stuff. And listened to a lot of podcasts. And then a law school roommate of mine sent me a text and he said, "Oh, you got to listen to the History of England podcast by David Crowther." So I started doing that. And that is indeed a super granular telling of the history of England. It's been around like 12 or 13 years, I think.
Wow.
He's sort of 330 episodes in or something like that now. And he's only in the first half of the 17th century too.
Wow.
So I thought, has anyone really done this for the Americans? And it really hadn't. There are, as you know better than I do, there are a zillion history podcasts. And some are very sort of general, and they'll talk about the Great Awakening one episode and Prohibition the next episode. They sort of bounce around. And some are sort of hyper focused. I believe you have one of those, the history of Rhode Island, the history of the American Revolution. But nobody had really done the sort of thing I at least conceived of doing. So I sort of came back and I taught myself how to do a podcast. And I'm sort of an old guy, so old dog, new tricks, that kind of thing. And I started writing. And the first thing I did was read a couple books on Jamestown and a couple books on Plymouth. And then I realized I was doing it all wrong. At some point I realized there'd been, kind of 100 years of Spanish exploration of the lands now encompassing the United States
Mm.
before before the English really knocked on the door. And even if you go back to various of the English voyages in the very early 1600s, which hit the coast of New England and so forth. So I rolled it all the way back, and I started right before. I did a couple episodes on the Indians of North America before Columbus, mostly relying on 1491 by Charles Mann.
Yeah.
And then I did 5 episodes on Columbus, because without him, nothing happens the way it happens.
Mm.
And you need to understand what he did to understand all the Spanish incursions into the, Florida, the Gulf Coast, and Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you discuss Verrazano at all? I know you have an episode on him, but do you get into him exploring Narragansett Bay as well?
Yeah, I did one episode on Verrazano, and I talked about the one version of how Rhode Island got its name.
Oh yeah.
And Samuel Eliot Morrison's theory was that he actually saw Block Island, which looked like the Isle of Rhodes. Mm-hmm. And then that got transposed by cartographers to Aquidneck, which doesn't much look like the Isle of Rhodes. But that this then got, described on maps and everything else, and eventually made its way into usage. But I it's been 2.5 years since I did that episode, so it's possible I forgot a detail or two along the way.
Yeah, bringing it way back for you. So you were mentioning some of the early explorers that visited the lands that now make up the United States of America. I want to discuss as well some of the colonies that were eventually built in New England. And I want to discuss them because they, of course, play a pivotal role in Rhode Island's history and really disrupting a lot of Rhode Island's history and some of its attempted progress. So I want to look at Massachusetts and the Puritans, and Plymouth and the Separatists. So do you mind helping my listeners better understand, like, who are the Puritans? What do they believe in? Who are the Separatists? What do they believe in? Where do they differ? And why is conformity something that's so important to both of their societies?
Sure thing. Okay. So regarding conformity, and we can circle back to that, conformity is the idea that everyone living under a particular ruler should believe the same religion. And that was a universal view, certainly in all of the Christian world, which is why in places with significant Protestant movements after Martin Luther, such as France, they fought these sort of existential religious wars that were unbelievably brutal. So, basically you had to believe in the same ruler because or the same God in the same way, because the linkages between monarchy and ecclesiastical authority were very tight. And so if you didn't, you were a rebel and had to be dealt with as such. And, kings are not all that keen with rebels. The weird thing about England, or the unusual thing about England, is that it had a sort of mixed Reformation, an incomplete one. And it, of course, began famously with Henry VIII severing ties with Rome so that he could get divorced and remarry and father a son. And so the Anglican Church was, although Protestant in the way we think about it today, retained a great many of the trappings of Catholicism. And that came into being. But at the same time, Calvinism, true Reformation religion, was spreading into England.
Hmm.
And so they had this top-down revolution driven by Henry VIII, and then reversed by Mary Tudor, and then reversed again by Elizabeth. And at the same time, true Protestantism was spreading. And the true Protestants, these Calvinists, took various forms, Presbyterians in Scotland. And in England, they became Puritans.
Yep.
Most of the Puritans found a way to operate, under Elizabeth anyway, within the Church of England. And they essentially would go to the Church of England. They'd do the Church of England things they had to do to stay in good stead and not get fined for not going to church and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But by the same token, they would then gather and have separate worship services and everything else. So they operated within that.
Yeah.
But there was a sort of and all of this could be quibbled with. It's all generalization, high level. But there was this basic problem, which was if you were a true Protestant, you viewed the Church of Rome as having been corrupted by the Antichrist. The Church of Rome was doing Satan's work. And the next question occurred to a lot of Englishmen, which was, okay, well, we still have the same hierarchy of sort of clergy and bishops and archbishops that we had before. They used to report to Rome. Now they report to the Archbishop of Canterbury or whatever. But how have they explained how they're not doing the work of the Antichrist? And this became an extremely troubling question. And there was a movement, they're known as Brownists. A guy named Brown sort of started to work this through, and it emerged in various parts of England and developed followings. And the Brownists were not playing ball, and essentially, concluded that they had to separate. And that's the original story of the sort of separatists who eventually, a subset of whom fled to Leiden in the Netherlands in, I think, 1607, about as Jamestown was getting going. And they were there for a number of years. So you had Puritans who were adamant that they remained a part of the Church of England, and then you had separatists who were also Puritans, but had concluded they could not any longer be part of the Church of England, and so these were, all dissidents at some level, but the conventional Puritans did a better job for a while of staying out of trouble. Then what happened after Elizabeth died and James I succeeded her is the crown became more committed to the conventional church, and that got very bound up in royal assertions of power from first James I and then his son Charles I more aggressively, trying to claim, contrary to English law and tradition, rule by absolute authority. And that was a big departure. And really, there were began to emerge sort of, you can't call them political parties, but call them, factions among the elites in England that were, hardcore royalists and clearly devoted to the Church of England. And then a subset of, and you could never call them small d Democrats or small r Republicans, but call them parliamentarians, people who believed in the assertion of parliamentary power. And for all kinds of reasons, most Puritans aligned with the parliamentarians.
Yeah.
And this created a sort of commingling of political crisis and a religious crisis that eventually resulted in a lot of sort of mainstream Puritans deciding that they also had to leave England. And that triggered the so-called Puritan Great Migration, which resulted in Puritans leaving England to go all sorts of places, including tens of thousands to the Caribbean, a whole bunch to Ireland, and then the famous Puritan Great Migration that influences the history you're concerned with, and I am, to Massachusetts, famously first under John Endicott in 1628, and then sort of laying the groundwork at Salem, and then John Winthrop and the Winthrop fleet coming in 1630.
Yep.
So that I hope that's a decent high level explanation.
And then do you mind talking about conformity as well? Because Edmund Morgan talks about that a lot in his book, The Puritan Dilemma, about just how good Massachusetts was at ensuring everyone conformed to their society. Those who didn't, Roger Williams Anne Hutchinson, you're out, you're gone. Why is that so important? Why do they need to make sure that everyone adheres to their specific religious beliefs?
Well, because so there's probably a couple things to be said about that. One is there is apparently a bunch of more recent scholarship that sort of argues that a bit later, starting maybe in the 1640s, there was a lot of splintering even among the Puritans in New England. So that the enforcement of conformity began to break down not long after the expulsion of Williams and Hutchinson. This is not a topic about which I know a great deal, but it should be said.
Yeah.
The high-level concern was this: the Puritans operated under a commitment, under a sort of body of theology, which might be known as covenant theory.
Yeah.
And they believed that they entered into, in the forming of a church, a covenant with their fellow Congregationalists to establish the church, and a covenant with God. They also believed that nations had covenants with God, that as Israel had a covenant with God, so did England. That it made no sense to them that Israel would be the only nation on earth, the only religious nation on earth that had a covenant with God. But they did take from the Bible the very potent Old Testament lesson that when the nation breaks its covenant with God, when it deviates from God's law in some meaningful way, it will bring the wrath of God down upon it. And indeed, concern that this would happen to England was a big part of Puritan anxiety under James I and Charles I. They saw this drift towards popery, as they might have called it, not the delightful, petals you put in your bathroom, but Pope with a RY at the end of it. They were concerned that the nation of England would earn God's wrath. And indeed, England at that time was beset by economic depression.
Yeah.
There's all the literature, which I've talked about at various points in my podcast, about the impact of enclosing the commons and the collapse of the wool cloth trade in Flanders and all these other things that brought a lot of economic misery to England. And the Puritans thought that this might well have been because England had fallen away from God's favor. So when they embarked for the New World, it was very important to them that they establish a covenant with God in that capacity, and that they not incur God's wrath. And some of this is laid out in Winthrop's famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, which gave us the legendary phrase, we shall be seen as a city on a hill, which still resonates through American politics, although almost nobody knows what he actually meant by that.
Yeah.
I mean, we do, but
just the nerds.
not sure Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama had studied it closely. So, so when you had a dissident, Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, they put the magistrates of Massachusetts in an impossible spot.
Yeah.
Their view was, if they are not saying what is true in the religious sense, they will bring down God's wrath on the entire community. And so it was therefore very high stakes for them.
Yeah.
And so they had to deal with it.
Yeah. So let's segue from that then, the need to conform, a whole society needing to conform. And if you don't, essentially, you'll feel the wrath of God. Let's bring that to Roger Williams. One of the things that I think is so fascinating, and John M. Barry does a great job in discussing in his biography about Williams, is how incredibly radical the town of Providence was when it was founded, and then eventually the whole colony of Rhode Island. So you were touching on it there with the religious freedom part, where he was saying we're going to separate church and state. But then there's also the democratic form of government that he creates in Providence and eventually Rhode Island. So help my listeners better understand, help paint the picture of just how incredibly radical of a place Providence and Rhode Island was. What else is going on around the rest of the world that makes Providence, Rhode Island, such a unique place?
Okay, so if we could maybe backpedal slightly and get to Williams' particular views. So Williams had the personality or the intellectual inclination to fearlessly pursue everything to its logical end, wherever it led him and how uncomfortable it might be. And he and John Barry and Edmund Morgan both together, I think, explain this process, which we could take hours on. Rather than doing that, it simply came to the general idea that in doing that, Williams concluded that that even churches interfered with or could interfered with an individual's communion with God. That was an individual communion, and that if one entered into worship with somebody else who was not fully as justified, meaning just, you risked essentially corrupting the perfect and pure kingdom of heaven. And so he became this sort of extreme separatist. Now, he had several great advantages. One is he had a very winning, kindly personality. Yeah. And everybody, or almost everybody, not John Cotton, but almost everybody liked him. Yep. Secondly, he was immensely successful in his other endeavors, which readers of Barry's book know, I describe in my podcast. He learned Algonquin of the region better than anyone else. He thought he unlike others were committed to the conversion of the Indians, and he felt that he couldn't even begin to do that till he learned their language. So over a course of years, he became extremely influential, and but his religion became decidedly incompatible with the Bay. But unlike Anne Hutchinson, the case of Anne Hutchinson, like Winthrop never hated Williams, or didn't for a long time.
Yeah.
And they corresponded long after his banishment. Williams rendered services. Once banished, he rendered services to the Bay Colony, helped them at the beginning of the Pequot War with some Indian alliances and other things. So Williams was ultimately banished in late 1635, and he was allowed to stay through the winter in Salem if he sort of, kept his mouth shut. But he had a hard time keeping his mouth shut, and word got back to Boston, and the magistrates decided that he had to be arrested and sent to England. And so they sent John Underhill and 10 men after him. But Winthrop tips him off and says, because if Williams had been sent back to England, he might have been executed. That was sort of the peak of the oppression of the Puritans in England. So Williams flees into the wilderness, and over the course of the winter, moving sort of from one tribal village to another, he makes his way to Narragansett, and he basically cuts a deal with the sachems in the region, first to stay sort of on the east side of the bay, and then the Plymouth colony, which technically had a claim to that land, said, Edward Winslow was like, all right, you're really going to cause us problems because Massachusetts is 10 times our size, and they'll come hurt us if we're harboring you. So he had to go across the you'll tell me the name of the river, I'm choking on it, but he had to go across the river, and he settled in Providence with the permission of Canonicus, who was the sachem there. And he established a sort of a absolute freedom of conscience in religious matters, which he then, through ins and outs for a long time, was able to enforce. You asked for an example of presentism. So, he established a sort of clean and complete separation of church and state. And we might say, well, that's an incredibly modern. But he actually approached it totally differently than Americans today do. Today, we believe in separating church and state, most Americans, because they're worried about the influence of religion on politics. Hang on one second. Hubble, be quiet. Sorry about that. In Williams' case, he was worried about precisely the opposite. That the commingling of the state and the religion would corrupt the perfect purity of God's kingdom. So he arrived at his answer by means that are totally alien to the way Americans think today.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that was shocking to me, and something that is often missed, is that he wanted the separation of church and state to protect the church. And at least when he was in Massachusetts, he was pretty religiously conservative, if that's the right word, where he was very strict about who could be admitted into the church, which is something that I always found really interesting, and something that I was super surprised to read about. Because you think about someone who speaks about religious freedom, this man must be incredibly liberal in his thought of who can be a part of a church, but it wasn't always like that for him. He was quite conservative, if you could use that word.
Well, I don't even know if conservative is right. I'd almost say radical. He had a to give you an example, he was in Salem, and that was not strict enough for him or pure enough. So he went to Plymouth, and in Plymouth was filled with separatists. You'd think that Williams would be fine there, but Williams was a purist, not just a Puritan.
Yeah.
And he was very concerned, for example, when members of the church at Plymouth would go back to England. And they go back to England and they'd
Yeah.
go to services in the Anglican churches.
Yeah.
And then they'd come back and he'd sort of say, well, you were just in communion with the people who had been in communion with the Antichrist.
Yeah.
I can no longer worship with you. And needless to say, this sort of very, sort of unbounded separatism was even annoying to people like William Bradford and William Brewster.
Yeah.
So I don't know that they booted him out, but they were happy to see when he left and went back to Salem. And then that led to his ultimate banishment,
Yeah.
where he went and founded Rhode Island.
It's interesting in Edmund Morgan's book, The Puritan Dilemma, which I think he wrote in the 50s or something. I'm not really sure. He almost has a negative view of Roger Williams. Like this guy.
I have it floating around somewhere. I could probably even validate that. But anyway, sorry.
Well, it's interesting because he has this almost negative view of him. I don't really want to speak for Morgan, but like then when he writes the book later summarizing his religious beliefs and his political beliefs, he kind of says I was wrong. The guy was just kind of going to, which is really, I think Edmund Morgan's an incredible historian. I think that like makes him even better because he's like, hey, I misinterpreted what this guy was saying.
Yeah, well, he says in the book on Roger Williams that he'd gone and read everything Williams ever wrote, which I think exceeds 1,000 pages of his stuff still survives. And so,
wow,
there's a real ability to get inside Williams' thinking.
I want to move on to Anne Hutchinson, but I have one somewhat random question for you that I've been asking myself since I started working on this podcast a year ago. And the question is, do you think Roger Williams and John Winthrop were friends? And I ask that because Roger Williams always seems to be corresponding with him. He helps John Winthrop when it comes to ensuring the Narragansett side with Massachusetts for the Pequot War. But then John Winthrop also spends a number of years trying to steal Rhode Island's land. So I've always found their relationship incredibly interesting, and I've been trying to like understand were they friends or not. So I don't know if you have a take on that, if the two were friends or not.
Well, John Winthrop was a politician, and he regarded it as his job to keep the Massachusetts Bay together, unified, and conforming.
Yeah,
he had a high regard. All evidence suggests he had a high regard for a long time for Williams until he got kind of exhausted by him, if I recall correctly. I think that he found Williams to be, I think he liked him as a person and found him to be exasperating as somebody who had to deal with it. And the idea that, kind of 40 miles from Boston or however far it is, there would be this settlement of sort of, kind of dissidents that had an excellent deep water port and was beginning to conduct trade with New Netherland and England on their own and becoming its own force. That was a very that was a nettlesome problem for Winthrop, given Winthrop's mindset.
Yeah.
That's my take. I can't say I'm an expert on it, but
yeah, I've always found it interesting. All right, I want to move on to Anne Hutchinson, and I want to discuss some of the things that she's credited for that are remarkable. So I'd love to hear your take on that first, but then I also want to discuss some of the ways that she's almost misunderstood. And you say how one like looks at Anne as sort of a Rorschach test for someone to take. So let's start with like what is undisputably true about Anne Hutchinson. Tell my listeners about how remarkable it is that a woman, Anne Hutchinson, was able to cultivate such a devout following in 17th century New England.
Yeah, so as you know, I did 3 episodes on Anne Hutchinson, and I give my take sort of at the back half of the final one. So Anne Hutchinson's father was a Puritan dissident in England, and he was persecuted for his views, tried, tossed in jail for a while, but emerged, and eventually, as the Puritans began to gain power, rose to some measure of authority and credibility in England. And part of that was that he later in life seems to have developed a capacity for compromise, for smoothing over differences. Maybe he lost some of the, fire of his youth and realized that some battles weren't worth fighting because they couldn't be won. But in any case, she grew up clearly, though, hearing from her father that he famously had written a transcript of his own trial from memory, and he would read this aloud to his children, apparently sort of making fun of the bishops who had testified against him and all this stuff. So Anne learned at an early age that clerical authority was something that could be challenged and even mocked. And so in that regard, she had quite an unusual upbringing. She married Will Hutchinson, who came from her town, and he turned out to be both immensely successful in business. When he got to New England, he was probably the second richest guy. And he also clearly adored his wife because he tolerated her doing things that, were certainly unusual for their time. He essentially supported her when she, created such disruption in Massachusetts that they had to leave and go to this godforsaken place at Aquidneck, right? And he had to leave behind the businesses he'd built and all the rest of that, right?
Yeah.
So they get to Massachusetts, and as the Williams affair is heating up, and they join the church in Boston, and they had been in England followers of John Cotton, and he had come over the year before, and so they were in effect 2 years before, a year and a half before, they were in effect following John Cotton over.
Yeah.
And she had continued a thing that she'd been doing, which is she would get together with other women after church and they'd talk about what they'd heard. But she seemingly was so learned and charismatic that her after church discussion groups grew and grew and grew. And it wasn't just sort of, a half dozen women from the congregation sitting around quilting, talking about the sermon, but there were sort of eventually sort of 80 people crowding into her house or sitting outside listening to her. And they began to attract in their audience some of the leading men of the colony, including Sir Henry Vane, who'd come over and had been elected governor because of his nobility. In effect, they thought that if they elected him governor, they might attract other nobles and that would help them secure the legal status of the colony against potential threats in England. So many of the leading men of Boston started listening to Anne Hutchinson.
Mm.
And Anne Hutchinson, who I would say viewed herself as elaborating on the teachings of John Cotton, was very concerned with the path to justification in their church. Justification, as I said, was the essentially the condition under which the Holy Spirit entered you and determined that you were saved and would go to heaven. So I think the crucial theological point, again, super high level, the Puritans were big believers in predestination, and there's a whole internal logic to that. The idea that you were saved or you were not, and there was nothing you could do to indicate that you were saved. Nothing to, rather, I said that wrong. Nothing you could do to improve the odds that you were saved. So they called this idea a covenant of grace. You either had grace or you didn't. This created a big problem for the Puritans, right? Because it could lead to sort of nihilism. If everybody's saved or not, then why not just lead any libertine life you wanted to lead? Well, in fact, it led to the opposite effect, because the Puritans also said that even though nothing you did could change the odds of whether you were saved, your behavior could indicate that you were, in effect. And so it became very important in this society for people to behave in a very godly way and to essentially, evidence that they were saved. Well, this crept dangerously close to the thing that Calvinists had rejected, which was a so-called covenant of works. This is what Catholics taught, that your chances of going to heaven were amplified or improved by good behavior on earth. Puritans thought that if you believed that, you almost certainly weren't justified. So she sort of first started taking the point of view that most of the ministers in the colony were actually preaching a covenant of works when they talked about all the things you might do to demonstrate that you were saved. And then she went, or at least her followers went a step further, and they began to claim that they could see who was justified and who wasn't. So they took the point of view that they could look upon you, they could look into your soul, and decide, you're in, you're not. And this is obviously incredibly divisive. And it really set up the Boston congregation greatly at odds with all the other settlements in the region. And it was deeply concerning to John Winthrop. So, this history is well discussed in my episodes and yours. The authorities in the Bay had to contain this somehow. And they had a problem, which was the governor was a big believer in Anne Hutchinson. So it took a while. And so the whole thing was provoked by a very sort of hardline conventional minister in Newtown, Cambridge, a guy named Shepherd, and he sent Cotton a list of interrogatories, and this all became a huge controversy. But at the at sort of the crucial moment when the inquiries, after having they expelled Anne Hutchinson's brother-in-law, who was this minister named John Wheelwright, who wouldn't give an inch, and they sort of expelled some other people, and they passed some immigration law. They passed an immigration law, the first immigration law in North America, to control the influx of new radicals from England. And they sort of did all this, and eventually called Anne herself to appear in court. And this created a big problem for them because, in principle, Anne had no official position. Women weren't in a position of authority, so what could they do that was wrong? I mean, so the trial of Anne Hutchinson, which is really the only that and her excommunication hearing from her church are really the only two transcriptions of her words that we have. She didn't write like William. She had like a million kids to raise. Yeah. So, this trial to a modern eyes is super, offensive. That there's 40 magistrates. She's pregnant, sick, and standing up in this room, and they're essentially grilling her one after the other, and her responses are in the main magnificent. And so she's super witty, and she defeats their questions one after another. And but then at the end of the trial, when it seems she's defeated all the arguments against her, she kind of blows it.
Yes.
and starts lecturing the court on how they really ought to be thinking. And in the course of that, she makes a fatal theological error, which she asserts that she knows what she knows by divine revelation to her, as Abraham had divine revelation. And this is a gigantic violation of Puritan theology, who they believed that the only revelations were via the scripture. And their reason for thinking that was that, well, personal revelation, it could always be the voice of Satan. Okay. And so it could not be relied upon. So she makes this assertion, and this gives them the grounds to convict her and so forth.
Yeah.
Sorry about that long-winded explanation. I hope it doesn't sound bad when we play it back.
No, I'm sure it'll sound great. I wanted to add two things. One, I think it's really interesting in Lepore's book, American Jezebel, I couldn't remember the name, how she says Anne Hutchinson actually wasn't a feminist, even though now she's kind of admired to be one. And she was really just a woman of her time. She probably would have been disgusted or offended by the idea of any type of feminist ideology. The other thing I'll say is that if you want to better understand Anne Hutchinson, what she was fighting for, I highly suggest listening to Jack's podcast. There's a hot take at the third episode about her that's really interesting. I won't have him spoil it now so that everyone can go and listen to it. I want to shift focus a bit, though, and discuss the Narragansett tribe, who my listeners will probably remember are primarily located and inhabiting the western side of Narragansett Bay. Pretty much it's all of their territory. You can think of it that way. And in the 17th century, the Narragansett people become hyper-focused on producing wampum, or as they call it, wampum pig. Can you tell my listeners a little bit about what is wampum and why it became so incredibly important in the 17th century New England economy?
Sure. So wampum was were essentially polished beads that had a hole drilled in them so they could be threaded, and made from particular 2 or 3 species of different shellfish that live on the coast there. Long Island Sound, in effect, coast of southern New England and along Long Island. And they'd been manufactured by the tribes in the region since long before Europeans arrived, and were traded principally to the north, to the Iroquois and upstate New York, who would use them for ceremonial and other purposes, and valued wampum highly because they didn't have access to seashells and
Yeah.
such up there. So they would trade furs and other things down to the New England tribes. The Dutch, when they showed up in the 1620s, they positioned themselves quite famously on obviously Manhattan, trading posts up the Hudson, including Fort Orange near Albany, or at Albany, and in an outpost on the Connecticut River, which they called Good Hope, which is basically where Hartford is. And the Dutch figured out that they wanted to be the middlemen in this operation. And they positioned themselves geographically, essentially between the tribes on the New England coast and Long Island and the Iroquois. The other thing they figured out is they could massively increase the production of wampum by supplying European tools. So, try drilling a hole in a little shell with a stone, the edge of a stone, right?
Yeah.
It's going to take a long time. You're probably going to screw it up a bunch. You probably wreck a bunch of them. Now take a, relatively fine, iron awl and Hubble, quiet. Sorry. Apologize for this. I'm just here alone. I got no option. So they were able to supply the tribes along the coast with tools and massively increase the production of wampum. They essentially increased the money supply.
Yeah.
These tribes, including the especially the Pequots, actually, started making more wampum. And the Pequots got it in their head. They'd been a warlike tribe for some time. They got it in their head to start coercing other tribes into making wampum for them. So they could, and they cut an exclusive deal to trade wampum with the Dutch. Okay. So I had an episode back in 6 months ago called Fathoms of Wampum, because wampum was stitched together in these belts that were measured by fathoms. So they really, in that regard, kind of upset the ancient economic trading patterns of the region. Well, at that various points, wampum came into sort of excess supply, right? And it was like they were printing money. So they tried to find other ways to monetize it, and the Dutch introduced it to the English along the coast, and the English started using wampum, but that created the opportunity for that sort of broke the Pequot monopoly in a way, because it created opportunity for the tribes to sell their wampum to the English. And that was also very destabilizing. So anyway, the wampum trade really upset the balance of power among the various tribes. It caused conflict. Eventually, the Pequots, who had very good relations with the Dutch, started getting into conflicts with the Dutch, and various tribal alliances formed that might have led to intertribal war, and did to some degree, including between the Pequots and the Narragansetts. And then the English thought it would be a super good idea to put their own settlements on the Connecticut River, which, as you know, goes north-south through Connecticut, and a fort at the mouth of the Connecticut River. And this essentially put the English geographically between the Narragansetts, in the western side of Rhode Island, if you will, and the Pequots in southern Rhode Island. And there were a bunch of other tribes involved, and there's maps in my podcast episodes on this, which people can go look at.
Yeah. And I would highly suggest also listening to the episode you mentioned, Fathoms of Wampum. It was one I listened to twice actually when I was working on an episode specifically about the Narragansett people. I think you do a fantastic job of describing the wampum economy. I have two more questions for you. The the first one is around this obsession with land in New England, which I found really interesting because it's not like the populations were massive back then. I mean, in 1640, there's what, 8,000 people in Massachusetts, yet there's this continuous and obsessive push for more land. They try to steal Rhode Island's land, they try to take some of the Narragansett people's land. What made them so obsessed with needing more land when their populations weren't even that big? What's driving this?
Well, their population was growing, right?
Yeah.
So they had a ton of immigration to the Bay Colony during the 1630s until it stopped with the ascendance of the Puritans in England in the early 1640s, because then you didn't need any more refugees. I think my sense of it is that the land around Boston was in general not great for either, lots of agriculture or grazing livestock.
Okay.
And the land that they spotted first that was extremely, fertile and valuable for both of those uses was actually in the Connecticut River Valley. So that's why Massachusetts, both Plymouth Colony and the Bay Colony, set up settlements there, in addition to their desire to interfere with the Dutch trade coming down the Connecticut River. So there was sort of all of these considerations all at once.
Got it.
So I think that was the biggest factor. I mean, even today, if you drive around suburban Boston, it doesn't look like primo ranch land, right? Yeah. There's sort of rocks everywhere and, all the rest of it.
Yeah. All right. Last question for you. I tell my listeners far too often about how incredible Rhode Island history is, why it's underrated, why it needs to be discussed more. Another reason why I love your podcast, you have 6 whole episodes about some of the founders of Rhode Island specifically. So kudos to you. But I'm biased, obviously. You tell my listeners why they should be so proud of Rhode Island's history and what makes it so remarkable to you.
Well, I would start by saying that I think my inclination is that people should take an interest in their regional history, especially if they have family roots in the region or they've adopted it. I've moved to Texas only 12 years ago, and I'm pretty interested in Texas history.
Yep.
So I think taking an interest in it and a pride, if you've got identity there, it's a great thing. I think there's too little of that right now. So that's the general point. I think specifically, look, Rhode Island and its founders, especially Roger Williams, did a bunch of early things that, and this is very presentist, but they did a bunch of early things that certainly seem way ahead of their time. One, radical separation of church and state, which they maintained.
Yep.
And that, along with, essentially Maryland doing that. I'm working on Maryland now. That was really foundational and new. It was very new. Nobody had that idea before and anywhere in Christian lands. And I think the other thing that could be said about it is, which is quintessentially American, is because of that, Rhode Island became this gathering point for, sort of cranks from all over the East Coast of today's United States, outcasts, dissidents, and including some people who drove Roger Williams nuts. Like, he had, and it's not worth going into, but he really couldn't stand the Quakers. And there's like deep. I actually, my son went to a Quaker school in Pennsylvania. I never met anyone who didn't like Quakers until I started reading about Roger Williams, but I think they were quite a bit more annoying then.
Yeah.
They attracted sort of all these people to such a degree, by the way, that the Dutch began to get worried about Rhode Island, right?
Oh, wow.
Rhode Island was filled with all of these sort of, sort of dissidents and cranks. And, the geography isn't that big. Who wants these people that nearby? But I think that in the American tradition, where we really have a long, we have a sort of cultural affinity for the dissidents and the cranks.
Yeah.
I think that Rhode Island was the real epicenter of that for a very long time. And Roger Williams gets the credit. I mean, as you will tell the story, if you haven't quite gotten to it, I'm not quite sure how far you are. He outmaneuvers the Massachusetts Bay. He outmaneuvers all attempts to sort of grab Rhode Island from him. And really, through a sort of miraculous political effort in the 1640s, manages to get a charter for the place and hold it against all the encroaching neighboring colonies, Connecticut, and obviously the Dutch. So anyway, great story.
Perfect. Well said. Great spot to end it on. Before we wrap it up, first, I'd like to say thank you so much for being on the podcast. I cannot express enough, once again, to my listeners, listen to History of the Americans. Jack, to end it, do you mind telling everyone where they can find your podcast, website, hosting the podcast and everything?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, you can get it on any of the podcatchers. I don't do video, so it's not on YouTube. I probably should do something on YouTube. So you can get it on all the podcasts. Just search for The History of the Americans or History of the Americans Henneman or anything like that. And I have a website, thehistoryoftheamericans.com, where I have extra stuff in the show notes, like maps and other things. And I sometimes I have a blog on that. You can read occasional musings on history-related topics that come up. You can find me on Twitter. Look for The History of the Americans and or Jack Henneman, and it'll come up. So I am grateful for the opportunity to talk to your listeners, and I very much appreciate you inviting me on to do this.
Thank you for listening to The Story of Rhode Island. If you are enjoying the podcast, please be sure to leave a review and to follow the podcast as well. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode and others as well, you can visit storyofrhodeisland.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Story of Rhode Island or on Facebook at The Story of Rhode Island Podcast. Thank you again, and see you next time.